Hey, welcome to How to Build Reusable Infrastructure as Code Patterns with Pulumi. My name is Maddie Stratton. I'm a staff developer advocate here at Pulumi, and I'll be your guide through the next little bit. So we're going to go along and see how we can use some of the kind of cool stuff by treating our infrastructure as software in this way to create a component that we can reuse. Maybe in some other things that we're going to be doing with Plumi, because I don't know about you, but in my life and infrastructure, I find that I do the same thing with small variations over and over and over again, and it's pretty good to not have to reinvent the wheel every time and recreate things. So I'm going to start just. This is not an introduction to Pulumi workshop, so I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time going through what Pulumi is really about, but just if you happen to not be familiar, we use Pulumi really to think about the way we do modern cloud engineering. And one of the big benefits of Pulumi, as we're going to kind of see here, is that I can write my code that I'm doing to deploy and manage my infrastructure, to build, deploy, and manage my infrastructure in the programming language that I like, whether that's JavaScript or Go or C#, or in this case, we're going to be using Python today. That being said, while today's workshop is focused on Python is the example we're using. This concept works across all those programming languages. So if you're like, you know what, Maddie, I do not dig Python, I dig Go, like me, cool. What you're learning today will apply if you're writing it in your Pulumi program in code. The concept is still the same. So what we're going to do, I put a couple links in the handouts. The one that's probably most everyone is going to want to jump over to is the GitHub repo, and that doesn't have the example code in it, but what we'll be using for this workshop, you can do this all locally if you already have the Pulumi CLI installed and you have your own Kubernetes cluster that you want to use to deploy this stuff to. You absolutely can do that. Or, but what I've done is I've provisioned a Kubernetes cluster that we'll be using for this, because this is not a workshop on how to provision your cluster, but how to use it once it's already there. And I've also put a handout link to the kube config that you could use to access this cluster. That being said, what I'm going to be using is something called Gitpod, and you'll be able to do this as well. I'm going to show you how to do that in just a second. So you'll be able to do all of this in the browser. You don't have to have anything running locally on your machine. The kube config will already be there within the Gitpod, which is basically a browser-based IDE for the stuff that we're going to do. So I strongly suggest, if you're coming along with me on this journey through the workshop and you're following along and doing it yourself, absolutely use Gitpod, and I'll show you how to do that. So the first thing that we want to do, so I'm going to go ahead and share my screen here and just give a quick walkthrough on kind of what we're talking about. So this is the repo, this Pulumi component workshop. And the only thing that really matters to pay attention to is we've got this wonderful link that says open in Gitpod. And I'm not going to do that just yet, because the other thing you have to have set up for yourself is you need to be able to do this workshop. You need to have an account on Pulumi.com, which is free, doesn't cost you anything, and you can log in with GitHub if that's your preferred provider. So I'm going to show you, I'm going to do a quick step through of that process with a different GitHub account of mine, which I'll be using for that. So I'm going to go ahead and switch over to, if I go to Pulumi.com, and I'm going to go ahead and say, if you already have a Pulumi account, or if it's a new one, either way, we're going to click this button here that says sign in, right? This is going to take us there. And I apologize. I apparently in this browser, I thought I was signed in as somebody else. Let me go ahead and pretend this didn't happen. We're going to sign out. There we go. And now it should give me, there we go. So I'm going to say I'm going to auth with GitHub. You can use whichever way is preferable to you. So I have this Matt Stratton 1 account. There's my other GitHub. And it's going to go ahead. And it's that simple. This just gets me into Pulumi. So we want to make sure that we have this, because we're going to need a token from that. Now, I'll show you how that's going to work in a second. So we want to make sure you're set up for this. And then if we go back to the repo, to the GitHub repo, there's this wonderful big button down here that says open in Gitpod. So we're going to go ahead and do that. And what that's going to do is it's going to create a virtual IDE environment that's already configured for everything that we need. So what it's going to do is it's going to have the Pulumi CLI installed. It also has kubectl installed, or kube control if you prefer, or kubectl, whatever way you want to pronounce it. That's a different workshop to argue about that. But we're going to go ahead and kick that off. It takes a second or two to get going. And it's when it brings up this Gitpod instance here, it's going to run a couple of quick little shell scripts to get things set up. One of the things it's going to do is it's going to pull down that kube config, which if you are doing this not inside Gitpod and you need that kube config, there's a link to a secret GitHub gist that I have in the handouts where you can get that kube config from. This cluster is going away after this workshop, so don't think you're going to go run your production workloads on my own thing. And of course, because I'm going to go ahead and okay, so we're logged in here, and what you'll see is down here in the terminal, it's gone ahead and I need to be logged in to Pulumi.com. So what we do in that case, if we go back to our Pulumi login, under settings, we'll see there's access tokens. And so you're going to need to create a token. So we're going to call this one component workshop, which is going to get us, this is how we're going to auth to that. And then don't worry, this token's going to go away. So I'm going to go ahead and switch back over now that I've copied that. So when I'm back down in my command line here, I can paste in that token. And now if for example, if you want to make sure it worked, if you say Pulumi, who am I? We can see that the pasting didn't work that time. This is what happens when I try to be cool and give you a whole new place. But now we see that my Pulumi, who am I, said that I am Matt Stratton 1, which is who I want to be. This kind of got us where we wanted to start. So this gets us into the position where now we have ourselves logged into Pulumi and we're kind of ready to get going. The one thing, if you want to make sure everything is happy with on the Kubernetes perspective, we just want to make sure that our kubectl is working. And if we just did our command line, if we run kubectl cluster info, you should get something back that says, okay, we got a control plane running, so it's connected to my DigitalOcean Kubernetes cluster, so we are good to go with that. And now we can actually start doing some Pulumying. I'm not sure how to conjugate that verb. So in our terminal here, the first thing that we have to do when we think about infrastructure in Pulumi, we organize them into projects. And every project is basically a single Pulumi program that when you run, declares this desired infrastructure that we want to manage. So we need our Pulumi project. And every Pulumi project lives in its own directory. So we're going to go ahead and create one now. So we're just going to and we're going to call it production app. Just like this. So just go ahead and do an mkdir, and then we want to cd into that. And this gave us a directory. Pulumi is going to use this directory name as our project name by default. If you wanted to call it something different, you call the directory something different. Now, all that a Pulumi project is it's a directory that has some files in it. And you could do this all by hand if you wanted to. That being said, we can use this command Pulumi new, which will do this for us in an automated way. So we're going to say Pulumi new Python. And this is going to tell Pulumi to go ahead and create a new project using Python as sort of the template. And there's lots of different initial scaffolding you can do. If it's going to use AWS or it's going to use Kubernetes. In this case, because we want to do a little bit by hand, we're just going to say it's a generic Pulumi Python project. So we say Pulumi new Python, and it's going to ask us for a couple things. We need to give it a name, and it defaults to production app because of the name of the directory. Cool. Give it a project description. And this is going to be called, Maddie's awesome component stuff. You don't have to give it a name, a description. And now this is the trick. We need to say the stack. So Pulumi projects have multiple stacks, which you can think of if it helps you. Sometimes I like to think about them as environments. They're different possible configurations for that program. Maybe different regions, maybe all sorts of different reasons you might use a different stack. We're just going to use the default stack right now. We're using a single stack. The default stack is called dev. So we're just going to go ahead, hit enter, accept that. And so it's going to do a couple things here. It's because we're using Python, we use a virtual environment. It's setting that up, and it's basically installing all of the dependencies that we are going to need and creates the initial scaffolding for a Pulumi Python project. So now that that's in, we'll see that happen, and that's cool. And now if we go and we were to poke around in our directory, we can see Pulumi created a bunch of files for us. And it's basically, this is what our project is composed of. We have our main.py, which is our main entry point for our Python program for the stuff that we're going to be doing. We have a requirements file, which is our dependency info for Python. There's the Pulumi YAML, which is the metadata about our project. And in this case, it's just basically containing the name and its language. And then it also creates a venv, so the virtual environment for the project, the virtual Python environment that we're going to be using. So if we were to take a look at our main.py, it's not very exciting. It's just kind of telling us that we need to use the Python package to kind of get started. Now, we want to, we're going to be using the virtual env in just a second, but we want to make sure that all of our autocomplete and stuff is working in Gitpod. So we need to, inside Gitpod, install the dependencies we're going to be using. So we just do pip3 install, and we're going to install Pulumi, and then also Pulumi _ Kubernetes. So we go ahead and do that. That's just fun, usual pip3 stuff. It's probably actually handled because of the way the Gitpod got built, but it's just kind of our safety step. So now we actually want to, let's write some code. Let's create our components. And what we're going to be doing here is we're going to be creating, we're going to be using kind of the standard Pulumi approach to provision this hypothetical production-grade application to Kubernetes. And we're going to create a Pulumi component resource to do this. Now, we're not going to be writing code in our main entry point just yet, because first we're going to create this component. So the first thing that we need to do is we need to go ahead and we're going to create a new file called app.py. So if we just touch app.py, that gets us the file. And there's nothing in it, of course, because that's what touch does. And we want to initialize this app by creating a class for production app. So we're going to import Pulumi, and it's going to look a little bit like this, right? So we say we're creating this this class, which is production app, which is a Pulumi component resource. Okay, and we will knit. And this is just self name. And then we're going to be, because we're going to create this class for the production app arguments that we want to pass to it. Sorry that the text is small. I will fix that. You know what? I was even thinking I needed to do that. There we go. Hopefully that's better now. Okay. And I'm going to do this. Okay. Is that better? Okay. And we don't need so much of the terminal. There we go. Okay. So the next thing we're going to do is we're going to create a class for the arguments that we're going to pass to that. So, and then we're going to bring in our Pulumi, our resource options. Sorry. Okay.
Hey, Maddie, would you mind bumping up the size of your text a bit?
Oh, is it? It should be better now. I boosted it a whole bunch. Yeah, that's why I was sorry. I was responding to that. We'll do this, and then we're going to say it's production app index. So we kind of got this one handled. This was creating our, the class is actually production app. That's what happens when I start talking while I'm typing. Okay. And then we also need to create the class for production app args that we reference there. So the same thing, we'll do a def init, and then this give it our, we're going to take, what the inputs that come along for this. And these are probably, sorry, I'm trying to think about too many things at once. Because it's taking input, it's because it's going to be taking these things like the image that we want to use. These arguments are going to be coming from inputs from our Pulumi program, which is why we are defining them this way, right? And then if we think about things that we care about with a deployment for our production app, it's going to be the Docker image that we're using, the container image that we're using, I'm sorry, and then the port where that needs to go. So it's just self.image equals image and port equals port, right? So that gets us our pretty much the only parts of the production app that we're making configurable, what we're expressing that we can use in our Pulumi program are the image, the container image that we're deploying, and then the port that it listens on. The rest of this is going to be defined by us, the experts on our platform. So this reusable component, where this comes into play is that people have different expertise, right? And maybe if I need to deploy this production app, the only thing that I need to know to do that is I need to know the image I want to use in the port. And all of the other great practices in my organization that matter for doing this are going to be embedded in this component that we're creating. So right now we should, kind of look like this. And just from a perspective of, okay. We've got our production app args, and then we've got our production app that we are continuing to use. Now, since we want to provision applications to our Kubernetes cluster, we need the Kubernetes library for Pulumi in order to do that. And it needs to be installed inside of our virtual environment because Pulumi runs inside the virtual env. So what we do for that is first we need to activate our virtual environment. So if you do source and you do venv, then activate, that's going to now tell us, okay, we're using that virtual environment. And now here we are going to install the Pulumi Kubernetes library, right? And it's very exciting to watch software install itself. So cool. So now we have that. So now, because what we've done before, we were only using Pulumi, but now we're going to be using the Kubernetes. So we need to add, in addition to importing Pulumi, we need to import Pulumi Kubernetes, and we're going to import this as K8s just to make it easier for us to type, because typing Pulumi Kubernetes over and over again, as you saw, I could barely even type it for the import statement. And we're going to add a couple things to the production app class. So in addition to this, we now are going to add some of the definitions from a Kubernetes perspective. So we're going to add the app labels, and the app labels are going to come from the name. So it's going to look like this. And then we also need to add the namespace, right, for Kubernetes, or that we're using for this deployment. So this is going to be a K8s core v1 namespace is what we're creating here. Is made up of name, and then the options that we're taking for it look like this. And you'll see we're getting all this great autocomplete because it's coming from a library. The Kubernetes library is providing this to us, which is making this a lot easier, especially if you are bad at typing like I am, as you're all seeing, right? So we go ahead and we do our ops, and then we also are going to add the metadata, which is another K8s provider. And that's the name equals name, which we're going to get from that. And now we have, so we're setting the name of the namespace explicitly so that we don't use Pulumi's auto naming for the namespace, which is going to make it easier for us to find this namespace, especially since we're on this shared cluster. So we've gone ahead, we've got this saved. In theory, I think some of my bindings are not where I want them to be. Okay, cool. So now we've defined what is a production app. That's cool. But wouldn't it be kind of great to use this component that we've created? So we need to import it into our Pulumi program, which is in main py, right? So we're going to go back to here, which was a very, our scaffolding thing. And pretty much we don't need to import Pulumi because we're not using any Pulumi stuff. So, but what we do want to do is we want to import the component we just created. So we're going to say from app, and then we want to import those two things we created, production app arbs and production app. So now we can use them in our Pulumi program. And then in this case, we're just going to do the QARD, and we're going to say this is, first we're going to use this existing one. It's a production app. And then where you see, and then you're going to put in your name. So I'm going to put in Pulumi puts. This is because this is setting the namespace where it's being used. So definitely don't use Pulumi puts, use your name, maybe your first name and initial or something, because we might have a little bit of a namespace collision because we're all on the same cluster. And so we give it that, it's production app, and then the args for it are, the image is going to be this one for the QARD demo, right? So it's on the gcr.io QARD demo, and it's QARD AMD 64, and it's the tag is blue is the one that we're using. And then also we're going to go ahead and give it, in addition to the image, remember we have to also tell it the port, because that's what we defined in our component. So really we have that. So what we've got there is we are saying it's a production app with the name Pulumipus, that's the namespace we're using, and then the arguments are what's the container image to use and what port do we want it to go on. So if we were to go ahead and save this now, so now we have a Pulumi program. Now, the way that we tell Pulumi to run is we run a command called Pulumi up. And Pulumi up will tell you what it's going to do, and you have to confirm that you want it to do it. So it's totally safe to do this now. So if we were to say Pulumi up, it's going to step through and say, okay, what's the situation? And it's saying, if I were to run this Pulumi program now, this is what it would create. It would create a production app, and it would create that Kubernetes namespace called Pulumipus. So if we were to go ahead and do that and say, do you want to perform this update? Absolutely, I do, because it's no fun to write code that doesn't do anything. We're going to go ahead and run that. And now it's actively going ahead, and it created those resources. So if you're following along, and if you did this, if we run kubectl, and we want to get the namespace, and then if I put in this case, Pulumipus, because that was the namespace I created, we will see that there is a namespace for that. And you should get a similar result. Obviously, if you run get your namespace Pulumipus, you'll see my namespace. You should see also for yours. Now, one thing that we may encounter as we're doing this, I've seen this happen before when we've run on a shared cluster. If a whole bunch of us are trying to run Pulumi commands, not Pulumi commands, but Kubernetes creation commands against the cluster all at the exact same time, we might get into a little bit of a thundering herd. So if you get a timeout type thing from your Pulumi up, when it's actually creating, after you say yes, just try it again, because too many of us trying to do it at the same time may result in a little bit more than what DigitalOcean's gonna let me do on my Kubernetes. Also, I should introduce, I was remiss in this, and I apologize. So my awesome colleague, Zach, is also here. You'll see him represented as Team Pulumi in the chat. So he's also here to help if people are running into any kind of obstacles or anything as we move along. So I want to just take a second and look a little bit more at what we did. if we go back and look at this component again, we've created a class that I can now reuse. So I can make this component available, but the person who's writing the Pulumi program doesn't have to know all these details. They just need to know the things that they need to know that follow according to our good practices. But we're going to give a little bit more of that because this just kind of got us to show that, yes, we can create a namespace, and creating a namespace doesn't provide a huge amount of value to our end users who are, helping us achieve hyperscale and whatever thing we're trying to do. So what we did just now is we built a boilerplate for our productions application environment. But this application component probably needs some services so that it can provide some value. And so if we go back to our component, in addition to the namespace that we create, we want to create a deployment. Okay. And so this is going to happen right under the namespace at the same level. And we're creating this deployment. And the deployment is a Kubernetes app deployment, right? So it's Kubernetes apps v1 deployment. And it has a name. And then we have our ops, right? So, and these are coming from, and it's taking the namespace to help define that, is how we're going to do that. So we can take the options from the resource options, and it's going to take its parent is the namespace from there. And then again, we have the metadata that's associated with this deployment is going to be a K8's metadata, just like what we did for the one above. And we're going to take the object meta args, and we're going to say what is the namespace for this deployment. So the namespace is going to be that metadata name that we create, namespace metadata name, and then the labels are equals app labels. Okay, so we got that. That's very exciting. That's our metadata. Now we're going to create the spec for the deployment, right? So the spec is K8's apps v1, and this is the deployment spec args. So right, so these are, so we're passing those along. And we want to say, okay, we're going to say there are 3 replicas for this. Now, one of the things, this could always come from a different configuration. If maybe this was something that we wanted to make configurable, just like we said that the name and the container image was configurable, we could do that. But in this case, we say, no, we have our practices here. I don't care how many replicas you want, you get 3, right? I don't know how you run your infrastructure, but I like to deploy with an iron fist. So we have our K8's meta, and then we're going to give it the labels, right? So it's label selector args, and it's match labels to app labels. And then the template is defined like this, right? K8's I really need to catch up on my Mavis Beacon teaches typing, is for sure. So then the metadata on the template. Oops. Getting a lot of work from app labels over here, but that's all right. And then the spec is created inside here, inside this argument. This is another core v1. And name equals name. And now remember, we've got our image for this, right? Args image, and then the ports. we know it's going to be on this, and then the container port is again that argument, right? args.port. And we'll go ahead and delete all our commas all the way down. Situation. So what we've done there is now we've created the spec for that deployment. Now what we could do here if we wanted to is if I run a Pulumi up, and I'm not going to apply it. I'll clear this for you so you don't see this. So if I were to run Pulumi up at this point, we can see that it would want to do something different. Oh, there we go. Invalid syntax. What did we not like here? Line 85. Nope. Line 43. Okay. Name equals name. I know I'm missing something here, so just give me 1 second. Okay, wait. There's our selector. Okay, replicas equal 3. Our selector. Yeah, I think. Hang on. Selector. Okay, it's meta 1. Label selector args. Match labels equals app labels. Nope, that should be fine. Line 42. Yeah. Oh yeah. Sorry, I missed the we're not containing the you're right. So it's containers. So it should be there we go. And then sorry, I'm just gonna do a quick little because this is what we want it to look like. I have this saved off somewhere else. So yeah, this was the problem here. Okay, so if we were to go ahead and save that now, let's Lumi up. Thanks, Alexi. Yes, so we can see now it would say if I were to run this now, it would create this deployment. I don't want to do that yet because we're not done, but we can see that things changed. So now we want to add a service. So just like under here, after this, we're going to create our service, which is going to be its core v1, and this is a service, and our friend name. Going to do our opts. And we're going to take our namespace again. And our friend metadata. Okay, and then this is going to take the fun part of this is because I wanted to do a brand new Git pod thing for that, so this doesn't have my usual Git pod preferences on it. So some of my which is why it's not in dark mode, but that's okay. We're going to get through it. We've got our object meta args. We set our app labels. We have our namespace, and now the spec on the service, right? So let's do a spec. Okay, it's core v1 service. Now our service args, and then the ports on the service. And this time we're going to get this right. There we go. And then we do the here. We didn't miss it this time. We already know that this is the thing that we're doing. We're saying our target port equals HTTP. And after this, and this is of the type load balancer. And that's going to go ahead and add our service. And the last thing, this adds the resources that our application needs, but we want to be able to know what it created so that we can use that. And that's one of the things that's really helpful with Pulumi is we can export things that can be imported either into another Pulumi program if we're passing things along, or even just back out to me, something I want to know. So I want to register the outputs of this component. And this, again, would let us pass the outputs from resources within our component to another component that we expose. In this case, we're just going to use that to see the URL that gets created. But first, we need to let our component know what we're going to do with the output. So what we want to do there, where we create our production app class, is we are just at the very top here before we define it. We are just going to say, this is what we're creating, an output called URL. Something and this is going to grab a Pulumi output, and it's a string, right? And all that's doing there is just saying, now this class has URL, which is of the type, Pulumi output in the string format. Then after everything is said and done, we're going to go ahead and export this out so that we can use it, right? So we're going to go ahead down here and we're going to say, that URL for our component is svc status apply, and this is going to take the load balancer and just take the ingress, the first ingress that it's gonna have. Because in this case, we already know one, and it's going to be the IP. So that's telling us what's. And then what we do if we say self, if we register the output, that's going to tell Pulumi that this is something to output, right? And so that's going to be URL, and it's going to have the value of URL that we got from there. So if we were to go ahead and save this now, and now we want to go ahead and provision our application. We're ready to do this thing. So we're going to go ahead and do ourselves a Pulumi up. And this is now saying, in addition to the namespace, but this would say it still needs to create the service, and it still needs to create the deployment because we didn't run this last time. So if we go ahead and say, yes, go ahead and perform this update, it's going to go ahead, and that's exactly what it's going to do, right? It's going to create that service, and it's going to create that deployment. So you can go ahead and try that. And then we'll be able to get the output, which is going to be that URL that we pull back. And it takes like a hot second here because DigitalOcean Kubernetes takes a minute or two to kind of allocate the IP address to the load balancer service. So we have a little bit of patience where that comes in. So while this is going, I think, to me, again, a lot of this reusable pattern is where a lot of the power of treating your infrastructure as software in this way comes in, because I, kind of in my classic config management background, when I was to think about Tomcat, it'd be like something like, we're not talking about Apache Tomcat, but, you could have a service, you could have a thing that could have a whole lot of configuration to, but the person who has to actually get one of them only cares about a couple things, maybe only needs to know a few things, or you only want to expose part of that. So by defining it as a component here, we're saying this is how we do these things when you want to deploy the application. You can just put in the parameters that matter to you for your specific requirements. And that's really when we start to see the power of infrastructure as software, right? Where it's applying in that way. I'm going ahead and letting this this one always gets me. I'm like, sure it's working, but it's totally working. And so it got the deployment handled. That service just takes a minute. A couple things I want to mention while we're sitting and waiting. If you aren't already part of our community Slack, that is absolutely a great place to get help from people inside the Pulumi community, who may or may not work at Pulumi. And we also have just because, as you may know, one of the downsides of Slack is that it messages kind of roll off after time, especially if it's an active Slack like ours is. So we also just enabled, if you were to go to the Pulumi /Pulumi repo on GitHub, we have GitHub discussions, which is more of a long running knowledge base forum. Okay, so now we got ourselves this. And so if I were to do Pulumi stack output URL, I did something wrong with that. So I don't know why I didn't get my, give me 1 second to. That's what happens when we did register it as URL, so that. Okay, so let me figure out why my output didn't come in here. So we do. Okay. Here's what I did here. I knew I missed a step because I was too busy talking. The component sends this output to the Pulumi program. We never told our Pulumi program what to do with this. So we're going to go ahead and redo. The other thing is we want to go ahead and create, if we have our, we had this thing that was called example before, and I'm sorry, it's called Cuard, which is fine. So we know that that's the resource it created. And now if I do Pulumi export, I need to export URL, which is cuard.url. So now if I were to go and run Pulumi up again, it's going to tell me it doesn't actually have to do anything. We have to import Pulumi again. Because remember before I said we weren't using Pulumi? Well, we are, because now I want to use that. There we go. So now you can see it actually would export that. And if I run the Pulumi up, you're going to see it's not going to really need to do anything. So now if I were to say Pulumi stack output URL, we give me that. So if I were to sit here and if I wanted to curl, and I can get that from the parameter and just say Pulumi stack output URL, it's going to go ahead and curl, and I actually get my result of what my application does, this QR demo. And so again, this is the component can pass that along, which we can get. In this case, all that we were doing with it is just exporting that value, but my Pulumi program could do more things. Maybe there's things it does after it does this deployment where it needs to know the URL, it needs to know that ingress IP so it can move on and do its next piece, which is where all of this stuff really comes in. So yeah, I want to take a second, see if there are any questions. We've been kind of getting some feedback as we go. If you have questions that occurred to you later, our community Slack is great. You can find me on Twitter at Matt Stratton. I'm happy to try and help you get along with everything you need to. But we've got the GitHub discussions, the great knowledge base, as well as our community Slack, which is at slack.pulumi.com to register for that. And if we don't have any questions, I think we got ourselves through building this component. It's the beginnings of things that you can do. Obviously, our infrastructure is usually a little more complex than a single deployment, but all of these pieces and parts together can give us a whole lot of power. And the final thing that I would do here is if I say, you know what, I'm done with this, and this is just a helpful thing to know as you're working with Pulumi. If I do a Pulumi destroy, this is going to go ahead and it's going to say, everything that was created by this Pulumi program, go ahead and remove it. So it's going to go ahead and remove that namespace, that service, and that deployment when that comes along. So especially if you're using cloud resources and you're doing some labs and testing things out, Pulumi Destroy can absolutely be your friend. So with no other questions, thank you for coming along with me today on this this workshop journey. Find us in the Slack and enjoy your infrastructure as software and cloud engineering world. Hang on, let me figure out why I don't know what I'm doing here. I apologize.